Good evening and welcome to the Review and Debates. My name is Akash and thank you for joining us. Today we'll be debating referendums are a threat to democracy. Just as we speak, in a postal vote in Australia, Australians have voted 61.6% in favor of legalizing same-sex marriage in a non-binding poll with 79.5% participation. So we're having a very timely debate today, and speaking for the fact that referendums are a threat to democracy is our lead speaker, Professor Michael Shenefelt. Professor Shenefelt is a clinical professor of liberal studies at NYU and the author of two books, The Questions of Moral Philosophy and If A, Then B, How the World Discovered Logic. He has won 4 teaching awards while serving on the faculty of the university, and he specializes in classics of philosophy and political theory. Supporting professor today is Milad Mohammadi, who is a senior in the College of Arts and Science studying history and political science. Leading the opposition is Anand Balaji, who is a junior in Stern studying finance and data science with a minor in politics. And supporting him is Bartholomew, who is a senior in the College of Arts and Science studying public policy with a business studies minor. Ladies and gentlemen, your debaters.
You know, I'm one of those little guys, and you put me behind a podium and I kind of disappear. So I'm wondering, will I be violating any rules if I step out from behind it? Well, I just want to say first, thank you very much for having me, and it's a real pleasure to participate, a chance for me to learn something. Gosh, and it is a hard one, isn't it? I'm speaking for the notion that referendums are a threat. I guess when we talk about referendums, in a lot of ways we're talking about democracy and just what we mean by that expression. Whenever democracy comes up, I do think of a remark from Winston Churchill in the British House of Commons in 1947, and I paraphrase it a little, but this was the sense. Churchill insisted that democracy is a terrible form of government, and the trouble was that the other forms were worse. So his basic notion here is that it's a question of the lesser evil. All systems of government go wrong. They all make mistakes. We'll probably find that almost any system often does the right thing too. But the question is, where are your odds better? I think the question of referendums is also a question of the lesser evil. And I think what we often have in mind are two competing possibilities. One basically modeled on the very ancient notion of rule by a mass meeting, direct democracy. Of course, the term comes to us from ancient Athens, but the closest thing we can get to that, it seems today, is a popular vote, a referendum. And against that, there is the notion of representative democracy, or indirect democracy, where the citizens elect legislators, but it's the legislators who then make the decisions. Could I make a couple of claims about the issue itself? And I don't know whose side this really counts for, guys, so I hope, Milad, I don't mean to betray us here if I'm going over the other side. It seems to me that to decide this question by examples is pretty hard. You'll find a lot of examples where the referendums give what seem to you, to me, the right answer. Examples where the referendums give the wrong answer. You find representative legislatures getting what looks to be the right answer or the wrong answer. I think, for instance, of referendums that were won hands down by Hitler and the Nazis. Now, we know there was serious intimidation. Even without the intimidation, though, there were times when Hitler was immensely popular. John Stuart Mill called this the tyranny of the majority. We can think of times when legislatures have done things that seem astoundingly wrong. If you're complaining about Brexit because a referendum took Britain out of the EU, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. But remember, it was a legislature, not a referendum, that took South Carolina out of the Union. And all the Confederate states in the Civil War did it by legislative process, not by referendum. So my point being that you can find legislatures doing things you would not want. You can find referendums approving things you would not want. Just to count up the examples, I'm not sure it really proves anything. With me so far. The other point I would make is that we need to remember in the debate that referendums are a normal, traditional part of constitutional change. In New York State, You have a state legislature. They make the laws. But if you want to change the Constitution of the state of New York, you need both houses to pass that. But then there's a popular vote. There's a referendum on it. And that's part of the Constitution of the state. It works that way in California. Ireland recently legalized same-sex marriage. But we need to remember how that worked. It was the Irish Parliament that approved it and then put it to the voters. The voters overwhelmingly approved it, but that's the traditional constitutional process. It seems to me that the debate doesn't make sense if we're going to challenge the notion of a referendum as part of constitutional change. That's normal. It's allied with action by an elected legislature. So it's a kind of mix. Where it really gets controversial, and I think where the real issue of the day is, it's when you have a referendum supplanting the normal legislative process, where the legislators are not taking a stand, they're not voting, the committees are not working, they're not working on compromises. Instead they say, oh, we don't know the answer, let the voters decide it. And that can happen in a couple of ways. In California, for instance, you have ballot initiatives. And what this means is if you get enough people signing a petition, you can change the Constitution of California. Well, the voters have to approve it, but often they do. It's completely outside the normal legislative process. That's the thing that, to me, is disturbing. The Brexit vote is similar in this respect. It wasn't a popular initiative, but it was a case where Parliament said, we're not going to decide the issue, we're going to trust the wisdom of the people. And so they went to a referendum. I think that's the kind of referendum that's on the rise today. That's the kind that critics see as dangerous. And there is, I think, a powerful case to be made in favor of that process, but I'm speaking in the opposition here, and I'm speaking sincerely about this. It is my conviction. If I had $1 for every time I'd be wrong, I wouldn't have to work here anymore. I would do it merely from pleasure, but it is a pleasure after all. No, but just because I feel that way doesn't make me right. Can I point out a couple of things here? So far as the lesser evil goes, the thing we're all worried about with an elected legislature is that they will be bought off. If it's not direct bribery, it's campaign contributions. And we know how wretched that system is today. Legislatures traditionally have run the risk of corruption. On the other side of it, the complaint made against the popular referendum is that the voters are inattentive. They're not paying attention. Public opinion, very fickle. I think that line of argument is not an attack on the intelligence of the voters. Instead, it's an attack on their preoccupation. Like most of us, they have jobs, right? They're working 9 to 5 on something else. They can't spend all that time studying legislation. I have no clue about most of what goes on in Washington, and I get interested only when I hear some sort of crying abuse or I see a crying abuse on the street and I want to do something about it. But the average voter has a lot less information than the average member of Congress. Now, to put it in its harshest light, sometimes that member of Congress is just scheming, right? Maybe they're answering to lobbyists, but to call them uninformed, no, that's not it. They know what's going on. It's maybe you don't trust them. So I'm trying to represent what I think is the trade-off here. And our question is, which sort of system works better? I thought that I would try to point out a couple of difficulties with the idea of referendum as a substitute for legislative action. Always remember, I'm not challenging the role of a referendum in ratifying the action of a legislature. Again, I think of Ireland. Ireland changed its constitution recently. The upcoming referendum on abortion, I believe, will also be a constitutional amendment. That means that the legislature has acted, and now they're asking for support, ratification by the people. That can be seen as fitting into the classical theory of check and balance. You're not putting all your eggs just in one basket. You're not allowing the legislature to control everything. You have an additional check. They need to win popular support before they can change the law. Seems to me perfectly reasonable, and it's very traditional. It's this other problem where the legislature abandons the question to the public. A couple of difficulties with this. First, it's true that legislative campaigns can be corrupted. So can referendum campaigns. Yeah, that same dirty money can be used to sway public opinion, to support demagogues, to give you fake news, as they now call it. A second point is that very often legislation will move through an assembly. It will be bitterly fought, and yet, even in the last hours, often there are compromises hammered out. Cases where you get a lot of people finally signing on an amended version of law. Compromises are never perfect, but with a referendum, you got winners and losers, you got no compromise there. So it's an inefficient way of getting laws. And a third difficulty, what if you make a mistake? Let me point out just an example. Many will know from it, some will know from history. In 428 BC, the Athenian democracy, simple democracy, no representatives, voted by a majority to execute all the adult male citizens of the city of Mytilene and sell all of the women into children, all the women and children into slavery. Democracy in action. They went to sleep that night. I guess they didn't sleep too well. The next day, they voted again and reversed themselves. That's how close the people of Mytilene came to disaster. But how do you undo a referendum? Yeah? A legislature always can vote again. When it comes to a constitutional amendment, you don't necessarily want to undo it at the drop of a hat. It's hard on purpose. But ordinary legislation, you want to be able to walk it back if you made a mistake. Thank you very much, and I'll turn to our next speaker. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Anand Balaji. This is my partner Bartholomew, and we're here to convince you that not only are referendums not a threat to democracy, but they are in fact essential to it. Now, this is an especially timely topic given recent referendums in Catalonia, the Brexit vote, and the Colombia Peace Treaty. And while my opponent does make the good point that it's not a smart idea to look at isolated historical instances to try and make a determination whether referendums are good or bad, we believe that if you look at the broader history of how referendums have been applied and the results that they have yielded, it's very clear that referendums are beneficial to democracy and not a threat to it. Last November, Californians voted on 17 statewide initiatives and chose to legalize marijuana, increase the cigarette tax, and impose background checks on all ammunition purchases. Switzerland has had 180 referendums in the last 20 years, and next year, 2 autonomous regions will hold legal referendums to gain independence from their parent nation. As a brief point of clarification, as my opponent pointed out, we'll only defend referendums that were conducted in a free and fair manner. So referendums with intense voter suppression, or those conducted by dictators like Hitler and Mussolini to create the illusion of popular support, are not going to be discussed in today's debate because those aren't true and fair referendums. And now to our first argument. Referendums give power back to the people. The goal of any democracy should always be to act in the best interest of the people it governs. We believe modern governments are failing miserably at this task. Let's take the US, which many regard as the finest democracy in the world. My opponent spoke to how legislators can be bought off and corrupted and how it is a problem in representative democracies. We're going to show you how bad that problem really is. In 2014, Princeton political scientists published a groundbreaking report. They surveyed 3 different groups of Americans to get their opinions on upcoming policy proposals. Those 3 groups were economic elites, special interest groups, and ordinary Americans, about 90% of the country. And what they wanted to see is if more people in the group support a policy, does it have a greater chance of passing? And what they found is that the more economic elites that support a policy, there was a strong correlation to that policy passing. The same held true for special interest groups. The more special interest groups support a policy, the more chance that policy would pass. But when it came to ordinary Americans, 90% of American voters, their opinions had almost zero effect on the outcome of public policy. Whether it had 10% or 90% of public support, the odds the policy would pass remained roughly the same. This is the clearest example that America is not the democracy it seems, and the use of solely elected officials to make policy happen is not in the interest of a majority of voters. And this makes sense. You and I don't have the same spending power as a billionaire or a lobbying group, and thus our elected officials don't really care about what we have to say. Now, my opponent makes the point that in a public forum like a referendum, the public can be bought up by special interests as well. And while that is true and special interests can funnel money into advertising campaigns, they can't give the people the sort of direct political contribution that is currently given to our legislators. And that is a very big difference. We see referendums as an essential tool to end this blatant corruption and get power back in the people's hands. Take gun control. 96% of Americans are in favor of universal background checks. 70% are in favor of requiring gun registration, and yet nothing has happened. After Sandy Hook, Aurora, Orlando, Vegas, and Texas, absolutely nothing. And why? Because in the first half of 2017 alone, the NRA donated more than $3 million to kill any kind of gun control legislation nationwide. We see this as grossly undemocratic, and a referendum could easily resolve the issue. A comprehensive analysis of Swiss referendums show that they're an extremely effective tool in implementing the will of the people when the parliament refuses to pass a law that a majority of the public wants. So my opponent speaks about this trade-off, that in a representative democracy you have corruption, but in a referendum you have an inattentive voter. I would much rather have an inattentive voter any day than a corrupt politician that has the interests of lobbying groups above those of the American people. But also, we think that assertion that voters can't make informed decisions about how to vote is quite frankly not true. This year, or last year rather, we trusted Republican voters to choose between 14 Republican primary candidates, from Donald Trump to Jeb Bush, on a variety of public policy issues, but we trusted voters to make that choice. So why can't we trust voters on issues like gun control, or on issues like whether or not to join the EU, or make peace with a decades-long enemy like in Colombia? We think this argument doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, our second argument is that referendums are key for self-determination. Self-determination is when a country determines its own statehood and forms its own allegiances in government without external influence. The idea of self-determination is as old as America itself, when in 1776 the American people decided it was time for them to secede and make their own decisions on how they should be governed. The idea of self-determination is key for democracy, and the first article of the UN Charter states, quote, that they emphasize the, quote, respect for the principles of equal rights and the self-determination of all peoples. We are taught in our history classes of the great struggles against tyranny in countries like India, Cuba, and look to those cases as examples of the strength of our democracy. However, to secede and form your own state within the confines of an existing one is often much easier said than done. And the idea of a tyranny of majority is often brought up in referendums, where a vast majority of voters can exert their influence and abuse the rights of a minority who don't have that same voting power. We think that tyranny is much greater in the examples where a representative democracy does not allow an independent region or group of people to become their own state. And there is no greater modern example of this than what's happening in Spain right now. The Catalonian people held a referendum last month to solidify their statehood, and Spain responded by closing 93 voting centers, injuring 1,000 Catalonians in an attempt to stifle the vote, and the leader of the movement is now facing 30 years in prison for rebellion, all for holding a vote. It seems obvious to us that the threat to democracy is not referendums, but the government itself. Now, since World War II, 33 nations have held independence referendums, and of those, 25 democratically elected to become their own country. 8 nations use a referendum as a tool to escape the oppression of the Soviet Union and become a democracy for themselves. There is no better way to determine what the people want than a legitimate referendum. Even if referendums result in a country deciding not to secede, it is still better for the overall nation because now the issue is settled. And we think a great example of this is the Scottish referendum of 2014. The UK agreed to respect the results of the referendum and allow Scotland to secede if the referendum passed. The initiative narrowly failed with almost 84.6% voter turnout, and it helped to solidify the unity of the UK with no violence and no bloodshed. We believe that self-determination extends even further than just seceding. When a nation decides to change its national trajectory, like changing its constitution as my opponent supported, or by making peace with an enemy they've been fighting for 50 years like in Colombia, or deciding to leave the EU, it is the right of the people to directly have their voice heard. And if our opponents believe that voters cannot make an informed choice on the future of their own nation, then it's not referendums they are opposed to, but democracy itself. And now I'll address some of the specific arguments my opponent brings up. So my opponent makes use of a select few historical examples, like what happened in Athens several years ago, and he makes the assertion that once referendum happens, it can no longer be addressed again. This is historically not true. Sometimes referendums happen, like in the case of California. Californians voted against legalization of marijuana in 2008, but last year they voted for it. These issues can be revisited, and I'll give you another example. Next year, the island of New Caledonia wants to secede from France. They had a referendum 20 years ago, and it said we'll revisit this issue in 20 years. So that argument's factually incorrect. He says there's no compromise in referendums. This is also not true. In the case of Colombia, the Colombian people rejected the peace accord that their government wanted that would basically grant blanket immunity for this enemy of the state that had been fighting them for 50 years, and the government responded by amending that peace treaty and making it better for the people that had voted against. So that's also possible. And now the argument comes to swaying public opinion, and specifically the example of Brexit as a way in which the public can be swayed one way or another. We think it's important for the public to get involved in these discussions because it literally is what determining their nation's future. And as we saw in the point I brought up, that if we leave it to just representative democracy, the voice of the people gets drowned out in favor of special interests and of the very wealthy. And for those reasons, we think referendums are a vital part of democracy. Thank you.
So the question raised today is, are referendums a threat to democracy? First, we can only answer this question if we want to know what democracy is. Is democracy simply popular rule? Is democracy simply serving the most people and disregarding the minority? If we are to take democracy as an abstract concept, then yes, democracy is merely a label for majority mob rule. And the referendum is one of the best ways to achieve that. However, if we are to understand democracy as grounded in reality, as a system that affects the lives of millions of people around the world, then democracy is merely not majority rule, but rather it is a set of institutions that have specific elements which govern public life. In order for democracy to serve the interests of the people, we must seek to protect fundamental liberties, ensure laws are enacted through a process, and balance the needs of the desires of both the majority as well as the minority. This simply cannot be achieved when a state resorts to using referendums as a commonplace instrument for the enactment of law. We must always remember that behind every law is the force of the sword, and that law by its very nature is only enforceable through violence of the state. Therefore, methods used to establish such law should adequately address the demands of the populace, and only through an established process that seeks to foster debate as well as compromise in law. The creation of parliaments, houses of Congress, and other representative institutions were created in order to seriously debate and compromise on the creation of laws. The process of lawmaking in a legislative body allows for ample time to debate all factors of legislation. In a referendum, however, there is simply two answers, yes or no. When was the last time you believed any piece of legislation could be answered with a simple yes or no? We may say that, well, the populace itself is better adept to answer the complexities of lawmaking as we live by the laws compared to the sovereign immunity of the legislature. However, they understand how it affects their lives more than representatives. But is this really true though? After the famous Brexit vote last year, the #1 search on Google in the UK was, what is the EU? Many citizens polled following the vote were unsure of what they were even voting for. I am not saying this because I'm opposed to Brexit necessarily. I have many reasons to support Brexit myself. However, the process which resulted in the vote for Brexit was seriously flawed. It created an anxiety about what will happen next, and it created volatility. This points to another issue with referendums, which is how easily the public is swayed in reactionary ways. While legislatures are not entirely immune to sudden changes in public opinion on an issue, they are at least moderated by their faction and their interests that go along with them. So my opponent pointed out that there are special interests, but these special interests actually benefit in a way by moderating opinion and by creating factions, we are able to keep compromises in check versus in a referendum, it's either one side wins and the other side loses. In the end, the only way to protect democracy is to protect the institutions that uphold it. The division of branches of power, the courts, the legislatures, all work to make sure that democracy is a controlled process and serves the people. Referendums harm democracy by bypassing these barriers that seek to ensure there's a difference between what is nothing but pure public opinion and what is law. If we delve deeper into what makes up a democratic society, we will see that one side we have institutions, which are replicable in other forms of our lives, whether they be business or academic institutions like here at NYU. And on the other side, we have unfiltered public opinion and nothing but a yes or no vote. In almost all modern institutions, power is delegated to representatives, whether they be a board of advisors or a student government. In democratic institutions, power must be delegated to the correct channels to fulfill the needs of the people. It is not our belief that referendums are morally wrong or that they should never exist in a democratic society, but rather that the insistence on passing legislation through such process will not only lead to eventual demise of democracy, it will also have the potential effect of benefiting forces in society who are ready to take advantage of unrestrained public opinion on issues that affect the lives of everyone in society. It is our belief here on the pro side that the excessive use of referendums to answer serious questions of law will only lead to the deterioration, not the advancement of democracy. If referendums were to be adapted as a commonplace instrument of public change, why would there be any other reason not to allow citizens to carry out the fulfillment of law? Why even have police? The situation is clear. In Federalist 10, Madison lists numerous reasons as to why representative democracy is superior to that of direct democracy. Madison describes the volatility, the disregard for the minority, and this breakdown of democracy that is caused by permitting direct democracy in the US. This is the same reasons why our founding fathers never even supported direct election of senators in the first place. All this points to historical uneasiness about the danger of referendums to democratic society, and for all these reasons you should support the affirmative. Now, my opponent also criticized us for saying that we are hypocritical for supporting people being able to vote for a representative but not being able to vote on their own behalf. But we don't trust the public for many issues. We don't trust the public. We have a Bill of Rights. This is why because we have a Bill of Rights, we don't trust the public to make decisions about free speech. We don't allow the public to vote on freedom of religion or our personal property. We don't trust the public to directly elect judges to our courts. We don't trust the public to form a stable national defense. And we don't trust the public to manage property, which we leave up to private actors. And for all of these reasons, we can see that there's an uneasiness about majority rule. There's an uneasiness about the idea of having majorities simply vote yes or no. People change their opinions about issues very quickly. It was highlighted, for example, on attitudes towards gay marriage, which, as you know, in California, they voted for Proposition 13 many years ago, which banned gay marriage, and later, suddenly, after a few years later, decided to legalize gay marriage. It shows this is a volatile process, this is a process that is not stable, and this is a process that bypasses all of the institutions we have worked to create in order to make sure that law is a compromise and not running over your opponents. And that's my conclusion.
Okay, so I'm just going to read a few things that I prepared, then go into my opponent's points. So during this time, I just want to build off of Anand's points, mainly that going into one of his points on special interests and economic elites, that in this age where wealth and power are increasingly being concentrated in the hands of a select few, referendums can serve the purpose of checking these oligarchical trends of Western democracies, such as the US. Politicians can now be bought by shadow money campaign contributions, whereby outside contributors can funnel millions, if not billions of dollars and they're not actually legally obligated to provide the exact funders under a certain amount. They're not allowed to also communicate with campaigns directly, but it's very unlikely that they're not actually communicating with campaigns that they're representing. In addition, special interest groups such as big agriculture, big pharma, and the NRA, as my partner mentioned, wield disproportionate influence in US politics. For instance, even though a majority of Americans support universal background checks, it's unlikely that any such laws are going to be passed in Congress. Now, the other thing that we want to talk about, voters understand their interests and they deserve a voice. If voters, one thing that our opponents mentioned, and that I'd like to pick apart, if voters are informed enough to hear candidates' views on complex policy and vote for them, surely they're rational enough and informed enough to participate in a simple up or down vote on a question such as firearm background checks or cannabis legalization, both on a state and a national level. And critics of referendums will stress that since they reduce complex questions to an up or down vote, the population is ill-informed, they're ill-equipped. But again, this is an elitist argument and could be applied to indirect democracy as well. Why would our opponents and any critic not believe that candidates, under their logic, would simply be a reflection of the general collective ignorance of the electorate? Another point on turnout and one of the problems of the tyranny of the majority and of the minority, we contend that referendums are not a threat to democracy, they're the purest manifestation of it. Some of its principal problems are not so much indicative of a problem with the referendum itself, as our opponents pointed out, but merely just its current form. Just as representative democracy in the US has had some bumps in the road, I'm sure we can all say, to put it lightly, it took 150 years nearly to become a truly universal and accessible system to everyone, though that's still debatable in some cases. It's no surprise that right now we're still working out the kinks of referendums. For instance, in Catalonia's recent referendum, 43% of eligible voters turned out, with 90% of them supporting independence from Spain. So only about 38% of the voters, of the Catalonian voting age population voted for secession. We would argue that such a problem could be easily remedied in the future by requiring a supermajority of voters or having multiple referendums in between certain time periods. Now, one interesting that I found in my research on this topic, according to the US Census Bureau, turnout for congressional elections in 2014 was the lowest since 1978, and it was only 41.9% turnout. In 2016, we found that the United States Election Project found that 25.6% of eligible voters voted for Clinton, 25.5% for Trump, 1.7% for Johnson, and a whopping 46.9% didn't even bother to show up. So does this lack of sufficient voter turnout make for these candidates mean that these elections are illegitimate? Our opponents or critics of this would seem to apply such logic to referendums in many cases, that a low turnout doesn't actually represent the democratic will of the people. But I wonder how they would defend nearly 40% of Catalan voters voting for independence as illegitimate, but only a quarter of US voters voting for Trump, and even less for the Republican majority in the House. Would these be legitimate forms of democracy under their argument? I don't believe they would. Again, their problem is with turnout, not referendums. It's not indicative to referendums themselves. Again, just to conclude, we need to recognize that given the disproportionate influence of economic elites in the country, we need to see referendums as a natural evolution in the democratic process. For example, in the 1920s, the US approved direct election of senators rather than allowing state legislatures to vote in senators. This was done because of a myriad of corruption scandals, and this is an example where direct democracy took to the forefront. If we trust voters enough to think about the issues important to them and then cast a ballot for one candidate out of many, then I think we can and should absolutely trust them on a referendum ballot measure. This will not only assure, as my partner said, that the people's voice is heard on the issues that are important to them of the day, but it will also allow us to cut across the sickening amount of gridlock and partisan bickering in Congress, not only Congress, the White House, and our state legislatures. And in the case of Catalonia, or independence referendums in general, referendums are the non-violent alternative to a bloody revolution. and should be negotiated under the principles of self-determination, such as the UK with Scotland, as we mentioned, rather than brutally and nonsensically suppressed as in Spain. My partner and I wholeheartedly believe that referendums, when done right, give the people the ability to make their voices heard. Now, I have a little bit of time. I want to go into some of the arguments that my opponents... Other door. It's all good. So, one of the claims that they brought up, it's dangerous to allow referendums to replace the process of legislative debate and making of laws. We would agree with this. We would say that, they shouldn't replace the process outright. They're rather just an extension of a process that we're already trying to perfect. Another claim that they brought up, one thing with the is the example with Athens. With direct democracy, they voted to sentence a group of people to death, then they reversed this. I would argue that legislatures also make mistakes. You know, we can look to Japanese internment, Chinese anti-immigration laws. The government, even when it's elected, can make very bad calls that can destroy whole communities. Milad also brought up democracy is a set of institutions that have checks and balances. I couldn't agree more with this, but again, we have to see referendums as also a check on certain powers inherent to that structure. When Madison wrote the Federalist Papers, he wasn't really going into special interests, and he wasn't going into the specific power that they have over these institutions. In addition, referendums, you said referendums allow the public to be easily swayed, that special interests also still have an influence in that case. That's true, but again, it's much harder to influence 120 million American voters than it is to influence 535 members of Congress. I think that would make sense. Again, they also bring up this idea, we don't trust the public on many things. Yeah, it's true. We don't trust the public to make our military, to do a lot of complex policy. But again, we trust them to vote on this. We trust them to vote for candidates. If there's so many candidates on the ballot, we're expecting voters to look at their self-interest and say, okay, this candidate has this view, this one has this view, and based on my research, I think this one represents my view the best. If we're giving them that trust, we need to give them that trust in a referendum on a simple up and down vote. We're already saying that they're good enough to vote for candidates, they're good enough to vote in general on specific interests. That is all I have for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to our four speakers for the opening speeches. At this point, we'd like to give out the ballots for the vote. We'll now move on to 15 minutes of question and answer. Just please state your name and which side you are directing your question at. And we'll also open up to both sides of the debate to ask each other questions if they would so please. Are there any questions at this point? Yes, Cameron.
Cameron, I would like to direct my question to the anti-referendum side, specifically an example you brought up about how, you mentioned this briefly, about how we do not generally trust the masses and the public, and you cited an example of the Bill of Rights, and I was just curious for some clarifications about that specific example, considering we have freedom of speech and freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. We give a lot of trust to the public. What portion of the Bill of Rights were you referring to that you said the founding fathers did not trust the public?
I'll say that we didn't trust the public to make legislation or Congress to make legislation regarding freedom of speech, right to bear arms, right to property. All of these are prohibited from people, and this is an institution. The Bill of Rights is an institution that precedes the process of making legislation.
Is there any response from the government or the opposition? Nothing? That's fine. Yes.
Here's a comment I never see anyone addressing. Some of these referendums are so incredibly confusingly worded. You need to have a degree in political science to understand them. You can't even tell whether it's like a conservative issue or a liberal issue. When I vote, I try to make sense of it. It's absolutely gobbledygook. It's like, will you be for selling this part of public lands in order to put the money into this form of a trust? And it's addressing an issue that you don't even see in the newspaper. And now, I'm 1,000,000% against people voting on same-sex marriage. I don't believe it should be, a civil rights issue should be up for debate in the first place, and I definitely deplore people voting no on same-sex marriage, but at least when they're voting no on same-sex marriage, it's because they understand the question. On these New York state referendums,
Could we please have a question?
I'm just saying, like,
Plain English, that's what you want.
yeah, these people have no idea what they're actually voting
So
for.
I
They
think
don't
her-
even understand the question.
I think our question is, how do you combat, how can you say referendums are good if the general public can't understand them?
So I think that one of the points I do agree with them on is that to some extent as citizens, we do give legislators, we give them the right to make legislation on behalf of us because we don't want to read through 1,000 pages of legislation to make a call about something. And I think it's fair. I'm from California, and there were like 18 referendums on the ballot, and some of them are very complex. But I think that referendums are an important tool when a majority of the public thinks that something should happen, but Congress or state legislators don't want it to happen because of special interest or lobbying. And I think that there are a lot of examples of very clear referendums, especially on an international level, like UK leaving the EU or Scotland leaving the UK. So I think that if you take it to the extreme and you try legislating just by referendums, it's problematic. But I think that there are lots of examples of when you keep the question simple, it's a good thing. So agreeing with part of your point, but I think that doesn't discredit all referendums.
The other side, is there a response?
Well, you know what? Could I say this? I think this is complicated. If this looks simple, with all due respect, I don't think you're seeing the full dimensions of it. There is a case to be made for referendums. The whole idea of a democracy is ultimately to let the people decide. I think probably the basic tension that we see throughout, and I've heard James Madison mentioned quite a bit here, but I think Madison's basic problem here is to protect us from what he calls temporary majorities. Is it that we don't trust the people? No, it's we don't trust ourselves. I have a lot of impulses. I'll bet you do too. I remember what Huck Finn says about this in Mark Twain's novel about the impulsiveness of people. Ain't we got most of the fools in town on our side? And ain't that a big enough majority in almost any town? Huck Finn. It wasn't that Sam Clements, Mark Twain, claimed to be smarter than the next person. His point was we're all kind of fools. And so before you change laws, before you have legislation, the idea is you need more than a majority. You need a kind of supermajority, but such a supermajority that you're going to elect people to appropriate legislative positions, that they're going to think about it, that political impetus will be sustained. It'll also be checked by the courts. What he's worried about is merely government by public opinion. And as a thought experiment, suppose there were a machine where we could register our opinions throughout the day, and where we could all watch television and decide what Congress is deciding and do Congress's work for Congress. Would you really want to stake your liberty on that? And would you want the Bill of Rights also to be up for popular vote in that same way? We've hedged ourselves about with all sorts of barriers to change. And Madison's thought, maybe incorrect, was that you need that because human beings are impulsive. We all are. And it ain't going to work all the time, and there are going to be a lot of problems. But I think that's the basic tension. How much do you slow down the force of public opinion, and how much do you let it run? I'm sorry, that was a kind of disjointed response.
Milad, yeah.
To address that, for example, I'm a fiscal conservative. I don't need to know what the budget of something is. I just go to the poll booth and I vote for the fiscally conservative candidate, and I know on these issues that candidate will vote for less taxes or what have you. But when I go for a referendum or something like this, I don't know what's happening. And that lack of information, that lack of specialization is why referendums are inferior to allowing representative democracy.
Okay, next. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Excuse me for being a little late, so if I ask a question that you spoke about, You don't have to say it again, I'll pick it up from someone. Thank you for talking about thing in plain English, it would be healthy. But if that doesn't help either, it doesn't help. In New York City, we twice voted for term limits. And that's very clear. It's not 20 different ways. Term limits, yes, no. You're campaigning, what are you for? Term limits or no term limits? That's easy, right?
Some people are confused by that.
So we had recently, in a not too distant past, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who was originally a Republican, who then became, originally a Democrat, who then became
Independent, and then he became a
Republican,
Republican, and then he became
an
something like that.
independent. He became an independent. When he was an independent, he ran for mayor. And up and down, back and forth, inside out, he swore that when he ran for mayor, he was going to absolutely, to the letter of the line, support term limits. He did not have a base. He was not in New York politics. He was up against serious people who knew how to work the room, all the clubs and everything else. He had a lot of money. So he decided he was going to spend a lot of his millions and not worry about that because he wanted to be mayor of New York. Bill Thompson was the controller.
Ma'am, we have a question.
Very important. Had no money. Black controller of New York running against a man who had never been in politics in New York City, who spent millions of dollars. Thompson ended up spending $500,000 and lost to the mayor by only 50,000 votes. I'll cut to the chase. He remained the mayor for 2 years. He decided he's running for a third term. Well, what do you mean? You just said.
Ma'am, could we please have a question or else I'm going to have to
We
move
had
on?
a third, he said referendums
Yeah.
are not binding.
Right. Is that your question, ma'am?
Do people understand that ahead of time? We may not know that little point. He waited to the last minute, when we couldn't get in there. It's a political move. We had every top person in that room embarrassing him, civil rights, everything.
Yeah, the
Spent
people
the money.
voted no,
Okay.
and he gave himself that
Sure.
power anyhow.
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you. Is there a response from the sides?
Tell me about how we rework
So,
referenda so we can get that part about the binding.
well,
Thank
yeah,
you.
so some referendums are binding, some are non-binding, like the Australia vote on gay marriage. This was a postal non-binding vote.
What is the
Uh,
criteria for making them binding and not binding?
That's just a characterization that they'll put at the beginning. So I don't know specifically the history of the case you're talking about, but if it were binding, then he wouldn't be able to break
Well,
that
the
without
deal was
another
made
referendum.
between the head of the referendum committee.
Ma'am, I'm going to have to
who
move
wrote
on.
it, The
I'm sorry.
person who wrote it,
Yes.
okay?
Thank you. Can we have the gentleman in the back,
It's
please?
very important to know this.
I understand.
They
Thank you.
made a deal and said, forget about
Yeah,
it.
but that is not in the context of the debate right now, so we're going to move on. Thank you. Gentleman at the back.
I can relate. Let me know if you already covered this, but 2 points. One about how, this is mostly for the pro-referendum vote, how referendums usually become oversimplified with a yes or no kind of a vote, and that oversimplification kind of can be dangerous. That's why we have legislative kind of processes to help out coming up with better decisions, essentially. Can you kind of maybe talk about that oversimplification and the dangers of it? And also at the same time, the dangers of referendums for minorities in democracy, when essentially we have kind of this direct situation.
So on the first point about oversimplification, I think that there's like a lot of referendums that get voted on every year, but I think that the most pertinent ones that everyone's talking about in the world are what's happening in Catalonia or Brexit, and it was a conviction of our opponents too that on like issues that in which you're changing your national constitution, you should have a referendum because that's changing the trajectory of your country. And that's how we feel too. We feel that if there's an issue that's going to change your country fundamentally, like in Colombia, where they make peace with the enemy they've been fighting for years, it is important for the people to get involved. And we think that on these very important issues, it's much simpler for a voter to use a referendum than I think what this one was talking about with regards to Mayor Bloomberg, where they make a promise, but they may not follow through on it in the future. And I think that right now we have, like what my opponent said, is that we have voters that just voted along lines of I'm a conservative, this politician will implement a conservative policy, I'm good, I voted, I can go home. But that's not what happens. And I don't know if you missed this in our opening speech, but we had evidence that showed that the opinions of Americans don't matter in what passes political policy. What matters is the opinion of special interests and the opinions of the economic elites. And so we think that referendums are a better way of actually getting the people what they want.
The proposition.
Just to the gentleman's question about the wording of referendums, we can all see the evils out there politically. Of course, the problem is to find the right remedy. Are referendums the right remedy when they're supplanting the legislature? My colleagues in the opposition mentioned gun control. There's overwhelming support for greater gun control, and Congress is not doing it. But the gentleman also said that this could be easily solved by a referendum. So the question's going to be, who's writing that referendum? Right. Who's constructing the wording? And I know how the NRA is going to play it. Well, I don't really. They have a great imagination, but maybe it might go like this. Does every citizen have a fundamental and inalienable right to bear arms? Now, you think you're going to defeat that by 52%? I think that's a close one. And in fact, in framing a question for debate, if you control the wording of the question, in many ways you control the decision. And that's why in an assembly, you have parliamentary rules or Robert's rules. And what happens is you can change the question. But the wording of the question gets changed only if the majority agrees. So that's what an amendment is. Happens in Congress all the time. But my point here is that legislative assemblies have a process for deciding what the wording will be. And I think we should grant to our very articulate and worthy opponents here. You guys have done a smashing job, and I think actually you're beating us here. But that being said, legislatures are going to mess things up a lot, and they're going to be corrupted, but it's the lesser evil. If you think they're conniving when it comes to legislatures, look at what they do at ballot initiatives and referendums. They will rob you blind.
Thank you, Professor. We have time for 2 more questions. The gentleman at the back.
During one of the speeches, the term excessive referendums was used. What or who determines that?
I don't know if one of us
said. One of you said the term
said
excessive referendums. What or whom determines what is or who is
So how I define
excessive referendum?
Yeah. So how I define excessive referendums is as a replacement to the normal legislative process that representative democracy has. So it is as an alternative to having bills go through Parliament or Congress and voted on.
Is there a number you got on that?
It's just the replacement of the parliamentary system.
So merely one, in your mind, could be excessive per se?
No, if it is to replace the process in general, like having regular bills go through.
So even the concept could be excessive?
My colleague's trying to draw a distinction between a referendum, which merely ratifies an act by a legislative assembly, versus a referendum that's where the question has never been ruled on by a legislative assembly, where it basically replaces what a legislature would normally do. And it's that second kind of referendum that we are opposing. The first kind counts as a check on the legislature, which we think is good. But by the same token, notice, it's also a check on public opinion. The ratification doesn't even happen until the Parliament has first allowed it. And we're for checks. We're for those checks. Both ways.
We're going to have to move on to the next question. Xavier, go ahead.
Do you mind if I do one short question?
Sure.
So you've all talked about balancing things with legislature versus a direct referendum on different kinds of issues. And for the against side, are you really confident that on issues of the rights of demographic minorities, referendums would be more protective? Were we all 100% confident with the idea of a nationwide referendum on the rights of Muslims in the US? And for the pro side, you mentioned that referendum campaigns can also be corrupted the way that many of us feel legislatures have been, but are you really confident that they are more or equally prone to corruption?
Let's have the opposition and keep the answers as brief as possible.
Sure. So on your first point about the point about the rights of minorities, so it was Prop 8 was brought up by a question and also by our opponents, the California referendum that voted against giving same-sex marriage to Californians. And I just want to make the point that the Defense of Marriage Act, which said it was okay for states to not allow same-sex marriage, was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Clinton. And then 25 states opted to deny people same-sex marriage. So I don't think this can be seen as a question of just referendums that cause a tyranny majority. It seems that Congress is also told for doing that as well. But the second point I have to that is that I think the example of self-determination is a counter to that, right? You have regions like Catalonia and Scotland that are getting the tyranny majority, right? The majority of the country wants them to stay, but they feel they have their own culture, their own values, and they want to be their own democracy. And they can't do that in a representative democracy system. And so in those cases, it seems obvious that we actually help those minorities and don't hurt them by having referendums.
Thank you. The proposition, as briefly as possible.
I would say I am not confident in the ability to assess where corruption is greater, and I'm not even sure how to measure it. I guess on our side of the fence here, our skepticism of referendums and how they might be corrupted. I think of the danger of the demagogue. And what is a demagogue? It's someone who appeals directly to the irrational passions of the public. A scheme of checks and balances where you have representatives who stand for election only at periodic intervals. It slows down the ability of the public to make them react, and that is often a defect, an inconvenience. But it's there to prevent an even greater one, where a demagogue sweeps you away and carries you off on some wild, oppressive, dangerous program. And I think that's what Madison is afraid of. So when he thinks of the ancient Athenians, I do ancient history partly, to him that's democracy run off the rails. It's the horror story. And he uses it constantly in the Federalist, contrasting it with a republic. And I would add that Madison has a very keen sense of special interests. He says a moneyed interest, an agricultural interest. He goes through this long list. He says they grow up by nature in modern societies and give rise to the spirit of faction. He has a long discussion of this. He's a very modern thinker, but that's an argument from authority, I admit. But I think we're both siding with Madison.
Thank you, Professor. So at this point, we'll move on to the closing speeches from both sides, starting from side opposition, who will deliver 4-minute closing speeches, at which point we will collect the ballots and announce the winners of today's debate. Anand, please.
Yep. Okay, so I think it's nice and informative to make broad statements about what democracy should be, the role of the Bill of Rights, and the role of the public versus elected legislator. And I agree that they have made important points, that we do give up certain rights to determine every single policy when we have representative government, because we can't possibly analyze every single minute detail of something like an international trade policy as average citizens. We don't have the time, we don't really care. But from clear historical examples, and examples happening right now, on very important issues, either that's going to shape the future of a country, or an issue in which the people have an overwhelming majority and support a policy, but the government just won't pass it, either because of an action of gridlock, which we're all too familiar with in the US, of special interest groups. Referendums are an effective tool to promote democracy. So I want to bring you back to the points that we made in our first speech. The first of which is that the American political system right now is incredibly broken. The study that we read in our first speech pointed out how it doesn't matter what the average American voter thinks, it matters what special interest groups think, and it matters what economic elites think. And if we really want, as Americans, to have a say in what public policy gets passed, it's clear that this current model isn't working. And it's very clear why. It's because that special interest groups can give campaign contributions, they can set up super PACs, and these donations are much more valuable to a candidate than an email from you or I to our local senator. And to bypass that very blatant corruption, how absurd is it that 96% of Americans are in favor of background checks, but nothing has happened in the last 6-7 years of mass shootings? And we think that very obvious policies that Americans want can be passed by referendum. And this bears out an historical example when an analysis was done in Switzerland, and they had 180 referendums in the last 20 years, and it shows it's a very effective tool of when the public wants something badly and the parliament refuses to pass it, that the referendums are an effective tool of getting it done. And I think we have both anecdotal evidence from the example of California, which recently increased the taxation on cigarettes, which would have probably been difficult to do given the very strong tobacco lobby, which voted to legalize marijuana, which is currently scheduled as more intense than, I believe, cocaine and crystal meth, but Congress has done nothing to reschedule marijuana laws, and also imposed stricter gun control laws. So I think that's a very good example. Now, our second point we make is that it's a key for a country that wants to gain its own independence. I think this is the strongest response to any claim they make that referendums impose a tyranny majority. Because we think it's a very important democratic value to determine your own future. If you identify as an ethnic or cultural group or an independent state, then we think that you should have the right to self-determination. And historically, 25 countries since World War II have used the democratic referendum as a way to gain their own independence. And we think that's a very good tool. And so now I want to point out what I think are my opponent's main points. The first is that we don't trust the public. And I think this is a flawed assertion because we trust the public to elect legislators that will impose policy for us, and when it comes to very important national issues, we should be able to make it ourselves. And the second one is the issue of populism and demagoguery. But I think that it's much better for a citizen who actually has skin in the game to make that call and make their own choice about what's right or wrong, because that's what democracy is about. Democracy is not about us telling other people how they should vote. It's not about us telling the people of Britain, you screwed up by voting for Brexit. It's about letting them make those choices for themselves, and referendums are the best way to do that, and we think it's the best tool to promote democracy in this increasingly corrupt political world. Thank you.
I'm not sure how long I have. 4 minutes, okay. Probably shorter is better. And I just wanted to compliment again the different speakers, and our opponents have been very worthy ones and very articulated in their views. I share the feeling that the legislative system is broken these days. Probably most people in the country feel that way. I guess the question is whether a scheme of referendums will fix it. And sometimes, you know, it might work, sometimes it might not. I think, again, our opponents here correctly remarked that one of our very large fears is the fear of the demagogue. You know, this is very ancient, but I think of Plato in this, who said that suppose a man were in charge of a very large and powerful animal, and he knew the words that would soothe or annoy it. He might teach this as a kind of science, reduce it to a system, but never really concentrate on what was best or not best for the state. The animal he's talking about there is public opinion. And the person who teaches this art, the sophist. When you apply sophistry to politics, you get the demagogue. This was the classic Athenian problem. Madison steeped in this, but his notion was if everything were done by public opinion, the system really isn't going to last. Laws are ugly things. Who was it? Benjamin Franklin said there are two things you really don't want to watch: the making of sausage and the making of laws. So they're going to be ugly in the wording on the ballot. I voted on that one too. I first went to the New York Times to try to figure it out. I didn't know what it was about. It took a lot of study. I think one of the real problems to always keep in mind is who's going to be framing the ballot question. Conniving and trickery is going to be embedded in that process. Finally, just a word about self-determination. I'm not sure, personally, that I would want every group to be able to cast a vote and declare independence from the larger polity of which they are a part. I remember the remark of a legislator in South Carolina when South Carolina decided to secede from the Union. And Lincoln's position was, first, you have no right of rebellion if you don't have a grievance, and you're seceding before I've even taken office. There isn't a simply self-evident right to secede whenever you want. Nevertheless, South Carolina voted to secede, and one of the legislators was asked whether he agreed. His answer? South Carolina is too small for a republic and too large for a lunatic asylum. His notion was secession isn't always a great idea. Anybody from Catalonia, I wonder? Well, I've been there. It is so beautiful. It is so gorgeous. Honestly, my friends in Catalonia, I don't kind of know what's going on. But you know, one of the dangers is you get a state that's very, very small. The classic problem is local corruption. You get a small mafia. And that's what happens in a lot of places in the United States were it not for federal prosecutors. So the notion that you want to carve up every polity into smaller states and this is somehow a good thing, not obvious to me. I guess that's all I have in my random thoughts. And thank you so much for listening. A real pleasure and a chance for all of us to learn. So thank you so much.